I didn't tell my best friend of 7 years that I was done with our friendship. There was no argument, no dramatic falling out, no final conversation where I explained how I felt. One day, I just stopped. Stopped reaching out. Stopped making plans. Stopped investing emotional energy into someone who had been one of the most important people in my life. When they texted, I replied, but shorter, vaguer, less frequently. When they suggested getting together, I was always busy. I didn't block them. I didn't ghost them completely. I just faded. Quietly. Deliberately. Without explanation. Millions of people do this every day. They silently give up on relationships, friendships, even family members, without ever saying a word about why. Today, we're exploring the psychology behind this behavior. Why do some people choose silence over confrontation? What makes someone capable of walking away without closure? And what does this pattern reveal about how we protect ourselves from pain? Let's start by defining what we're actually talking about, because silent withdrawal is distinct from traditional ghosting. This isn't someone suddenly disappearing completely. Silent withdrawal is more gradual, almost surgical in its precision. It's a slow fade executed over weeks or months. You don't cut someone off. You just progressively reduce the relationship until it withers from lack of nourishment. The pattern follows a predictable trajectory. First, there's the decision point, that crucial moment when you mentally give up on the person. Maybe it's after one too many disappointments. Maybe it's a single betrayal. Maybe it's just accumulated exhaustion from maintaining a relationship that feels perpetually one-sided. Then comes the behavioral shift. You start creating distance. You respond to messages less frequently. Those instant replies turn into hours, then days. You stop initiating contact altogether. You become perpetually busy when they want to spend time together. You share less about your life. You engage less with theirs. The person on the receiving end usually notices something has changed, but they can't pinpoint what or why. They might ask if everything's okay. And here's where it gets complicated. You say, yes, everything's fine. Because how do you explain that you've already emotionally exited without causing the confrontation you're desperately trying to avoid? Eventually, the relationship exists only in the most superficial sense. You're still connected on social media. You might still exchange birthday wishes. But the real connection, the depth, the intimacy, the investment, has been quietly withdrawn. What makes this pattern particularly complex is that it's not always conscious or malicious. Sometimes people don't even realize they're doing it until the relationship has already dissolved. So why do people choose this path? The most common reason is deeply rooted in conflict avoidance. Research in attachment theory shows that people with anxious avoidant or dismissive avoidant attachment styles are particularly prone to silent withdrawal. These individuals learned early in life that expressing needs or discontent leads to negative outcomes: rejection, punishment, or emotional abandonment. For these individuals, confrontation doesn't just feel uncomfortable, it feels genuinely dangerous. Their nervous systems respond to difficult conversations the way most people's bodies respond to actual physical threats. Heart rate increases. Breathing becomes shallow. The fight or flight response kicks in. Silent withdrawal becomes a form of self-preservation that feels as necessary as breathing. There's also what psychologists call conflict fatigue. Some people who withdraw silently have tried confrontation before, many times, with the same person or different people. They've expressed their feelings, set boundaries, explained their needs, and nothing changed. Eventually, they reach a point where they simply don't have the energy to do it again. Silence isn't their first choice. It's the choice they arrive at after exhaustion. Then, there's the empathy paradox. Many people who withdraw silently do so because they care too much about the other person's feelings. They don't want to hurt them with harsh truths. They don't want to be the bad guy who explicitly ends the relationship. So they choose what feels like the kinder option, letting the relationship fade rather than actively killing it. Of course, this kindness is often more about protecting themselves from guilt and discomfort than actually protecting the other person. There's also emotional self-protection through preemptive detachment. If you sense a relationship is failing or might hurt you, withdrawing first gives you a sense of control. You're choosing to leave rather than being left. You're protecting yourself from future disappointment by ending your investment before the inevitable pain arrives. Clinical psychologist Dr. Jonas Webb points out that people who withdraw silently often have alexithymia, difficulty identifying and expressing their own emotions. They might not withdraw because they don't want to communicate. They withdraw because they genuinely don't know how to articulate what they're feeling. The emotions are too complex, too tangled, too threatening to examine closely. There's fascinating neuroscience behind why some people find silent withdrawal so natural, while others find it nearly impossible. Brain imaging studies show that for people who regularly employ avoidant strategies, social confrontation activates the amygdala, the brain's fear center, more intensely than it does for securely attached individuals. Their brains literally experience confrontation as a threat. The amygdala lights up, triggering the full fight or flight response. Simultaneously, there's reduced activity in the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for emotional regulation and rational decision-making. This means that in the moment when they're deciding whether to address an issue or withdraw, their fear response is amplified, while their capacity for rational evaluation is diminished. Dr. Stephen Porges's polyvagal theory explains that when people feel threatened in relationships, they can enter a state of shutdown, a parasympathetic nervous system response, where they essentially go numb and disconnect. This is the oldest evolutionary response in our nervous system, and it's what animals do when facing overwhelming threat. They freeze, they dissociate. For people who withdraw silently, this shutdown response can become habitual. Their nervous system learns that when relationship stress appears, the safest response is to disconnect emotionally and eventually physically. The body makes the decision before the conscious mind even has a chance to consider alternatives. Let's talk about what this pattern actually costs, because the price is higher than most people realize. For the person who leaves silently, there's the slow accumulation of unresolved endings. Each relationship that fades without closure adds to a growing collection of unfinished business. You might think you're avoiding pain, but you're actually just postponing and storing it. These unresolved relationships create what psychologists call ambiguous loss, a type of grief that's particularly difficult to process because there's no clear ending. There's also the reinforcement of maladaptive patterns. Every time you withdraw silently and avoid short-term discomfort, you strengthen the neural pathways that make withdrawal your default response. The pattern becomes more entrenched until it's not really a choice anymore. It's just what you do. When you habitually withdraw from relationships rather than working through difficulties, you end up increasingly alone. All meaningful relationships eventually encounter challenges. If your response to challenge is always withdrawal, you'll eventually withdraw from everyone who gets close enough to matter. For the person being withdrawn from, the cost is different, but equally significant. They experience what's called the slow ghost, a confusing, painful process where they can feel the relationship dying, but can't identify why or what they did wrong. This ambiguity is psychologically torturous. The human brain is wired to seek patterns and closure. Without it, people often create their own narratives, and these self-created stories are almost always self-blaming. Research by Dr. Kristen Neff shows that people who are withdrawn from silently often internalize the experience as evidence of their own unworthiness. They wonder what they did wrong. They replay interactions obsessively. They might become hypervigilant in future relationships, constantly scanning for signs of withdrawal, which ironically can push people away and create a self-fulfilling prophecy. Being silently abandoned can be as painful as explicit rejection, sometimes more so. At least, with explicit rejection, you know where you stand. With silent withdrawal, you're left in limbo, watching someone slowly disappear without understanding why. So, how do you break this pattern? If you're someone who tends to withdraw silently, the first step is recognizing that what feels like self-protection is often self-sabotage. You're not actually avoiding pain. You're choosing a different kind of pain: loneliness, isolation, and the chronic unease of unfinished business. Start by examining your attachment history with genuine curiosity. Often, silent withdrawal is learned behavior from childhood. Maybe expressing needs was met with anger or dismissal. Maybe you learned that relationships were conditional. Understanding the origin doesn't excuse continuing it, but it helps you recognize that you're operating from old programming, not current reality. Practice graduated exposure to confrontation. You don't have to start with the most difficult conversations. Begin small. Express a minor preference. State a small boundary. Disagree with something low stakes. Each small act builds the neural pathways that show you that expressing yourself doesn't lead to catastrophe. Learn to sit with discomfort. People who withdraw silently often have low distress tolerance. They can't bear the temporary discomfort of difficult conversations, so they avoid them entirely. But discomfort isn't danger. Developing the capacity to stay present with uncomfortable emotions is essential for maintaining real relationships. Consider what you're actually protecting by staying silent. Usually, you're protecting an imaginary version of yourself, the good person who never hurts anyone, never causes conflict, never disappoints. But that's not a real person. Real relationships require real people, which means sometimes causing discomfort, sometimes being the bearer of difficult truths. If you've been on the receiving end of silent withdrawal, first understand this: it's not about you. Someone else's inability to communicate directly is their pattern, not your failure. You can't fix someone else's attachment wounds. Set boundaries around ambiguity. If you notice someone withdrawing, you can name it directly. I've noticed you seem more distant lately. If something's changed in our relationship, I'd appreciate knowing rather than wondering. This gives them an opportunity to be honest. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself is to stop pursuing someone who's clearly backing away. Continuing to reach out to someone who's withdrawn is a form of self-abandonment. Here's what I've learned since I silently withdrew from my friend all those years ago. I thought I was being kind by sparing them a difficult conversation. But kindness that prioritizes your own comfort over someone else's dignity isn't really kindness. It's cowardice dressed up as compassion. The confrontation I was avoiding would have been uncomfortable for maybe an hour. Instead, I chose years of lingering guilt, unresolved endings, and the knowledge that I left someone confused and wondering what they'd done wrong. I don't think I'm a bad person for withdrawing silently. I think I was a scared person doing the only thing I knew how to do with feelings I didn't know how to express. But understanding why I did it doesn't erase the impact. If you're someone who withdraws silently, you're not broken. You're probably just protecting yourself the only way you learned how. But you can learn new ways. You can learn that difficult conversations, while uncomfortable, are survivable. You can learn that being honest about your feelings doesn't make you cruel. It makes you human. And if you're someone who's been withdrawn from, the silence isn't a statement about your worth. It's a statement about someone else's capacity. You deserved better. You deserved words. You deserved clarity. The truth is, we're all just trying to navigate relationships with imperfect tools and old wounds. None of us does it perfectly. But maybe the first step toward changing the pattern is simply this: Acknowledging that silence, while easier in the moment, is often the cruelest option in the long run, both for the person you're leaving, wondering what happened, and for yourself, who has to live with the ghost of every relationship you ended without really ending. There's courage in confrontation. There's kindness in clarity. There's respect in honesty, even when that honesty hurts. And maybe that's what real connection requires. Not the absence of discomfort, but the willingness to stay present through it.